Close your eyes for a moment and think about a goal you once wanted more than anything, not the easy ones, the kind that asks something from you every day. Now ask yourself, why did that fire fade or why did it grow stronger? Motivation isn't magic and it's not a personality trait. It's biology. It's shaped by how your brain predicts reward, responds to effort, and learns from small wins and setbacks. Tonight, we're going to look beneath the surface, past willpower and hype, and into the neural circuits that quietly decide whether you persist or quit. When you understand those circuits, goals stop feeling heavy and start feeling possible. For a long time, motivation has been treated like a personality label. Some people are called driven, others lazy, as if motivation were something you're born with and stuck with for life. Neuroscience tells a very different story. Motivation is not a permanent trait etched into your identity. It's a dynamic brain state, shaped moment by neural chemistry, experience, and behavior. That single shift in understanding changes everything because brain states can be trained. At the center of motivation is the brain's reward and effort circuitry. These circuits constantly ask one question: is this worth doing right now? The answer depends on how your brain predicts future rewards and how it interprets effort. When motivation feels high, it's not because you suddenly became a better person. It's because your brain has entered a state where effort feels meaningful and progress feels possible. When motivation drops, the brain isn't broken. It's simply calculating that the cost outweighs the perceived benefit. A key player in this process is dopamine. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the pleasure chemical, but its real job is to signal pursuit. It rises when the brain believes an action will move you closer to something valuable. Importantly, dopamine does not just respond to success, it responds to progress. That means motivation is strongest not when you achieve the goal, but when your brain senses forward movement. This is why starting is often the hardest part and why momentum feels so powerful once it builds. Because motivation is a brain state, it is highly sensitive to your environment and habits. Sleep deprivation, chronic stress, constant distraction, and lack of novelty all push the brain into low motivation states. On the other hand, consistent routines, clear feedback, manageable challenges, and recovery push the brain toward motivation, ready states. This explains why the same person can feel unstoppable one week and completely stuck the next. Nothing about their character changed, but their neural state did. Another crucial insight is that motivation follows action more often than it precedes it. The brain does not wait for motivation to appear before engaging dopamine circuits. Instead, small actions create small dopamine releases, which then increase the likelihood of further action. This creates a loop. Action changes brain state, and brain state fuels more action. When people say, "I'll start when I feel motivated," they are unknowingly waiting for a brain state that is usually produced by starting. This also explains why labeling yourself as unmotivated is so damaging. The brain adapts to the stories you tell it. When you repeatedly frame low motivation as a personal flaw, you reinforce avoidance circuits and reduce future dopamine release tied to effort. When you frame motivation as a temporary state, something you can influence, you keep the brain flexible and responsive. Identity-based thinking locks the system, state-based thinking trains it. The empowering takeaway is this: if motivation is a brain state, then it is trainable. You don't train it with hype or force, but with structure. You train it by designing goals that are just challenging enough, by breaking progress into visible steps, by rewarding consistency over outcomes, and by respecting recovery. Over time, the brain learns that effort leads somewhere worthwhile, and motivation becomes more reliable. Once you understand that motivation lives in neural circuits, not character, self-blame loses its grip. The question shifts from "what's wrong with me" to "what state is my brain in right now, and how do I change it?" That question is where real, lasting goal achievement begins. Dopamine is one of the most talked about chemicals in the brain, yet it is also one of the most misunderstood. It's often labeled the pleasure molecule, but pleasure is only a small part of its story. Dopamine's primary role is not to make you feel good, it's to make you move. It drives anticipation, effort, and the willingness to pursue a goal long before any reward is actually achieved. When you set a goal, your brain immediately begins predicting the future. It asks, is this outcome valuable? Is it realistic, and how much effort will it take? Dopamine is released based on those predictions, not on the final result. If the brain believes a goal is meaningful and attainable, dopamine levels rise, increasing focus, energy, and persistence. If the brain predicts low reward or high uncertainty, dopamine drops, and motivation fades. One of the most important insights from neuroscience is that dopamine responds more strongly to progress than to completion. The biggest dopamine surges don't happen when you reach the finish line. They happen when you notice yourself getting closer. This is why checking something off a list feels satisfying, why streaks are so powerful, and why visible progress can keep people engaged even when the final reward is far away. Your brain is wired to stay motivated by movement, not by waiting. This also explains why overly ambitious goals often backfire. When a goal feels too distant or vague, the brain struggles to predict progress. Dopamine release becomes inconsistent, effort feels heavier, and procrastination increases. In contrast, breaking a goal into clear, measurable steps gives the brain frequent signals of forward motion. Each small win produces a dopamine pulse that reinforces the behavior and strengthens the desire to continue. Dopamine is also deeply tied to learning. When an action produces more reward than expected, dopamine spikes and the brain says, "Do that again." When the reward is less than expected, dopamine dips, signaling the brain to adjust strategy. This feedback loop is how habits form and how motivation becomes refined over time. Importantly, this system does not require massive rewards. Consistency and accurate feedback are far more effective than intensity. However, dopamine can be hijacked. Highly stimulating activities, endless scrolling, junk food, constant novelty produce rapid dopamine spikes without effort. Over time, this trains the brain to expect high reward for low cost. When that happens, meaningful goals that require sustained effort feel disproportionately difficult. The brain isn't broken, it's recalibrated. Restoring motivation often means reducing these artificial spikes so dopamine sensitivity can recover. Another overlooked aspect of dopamine is its relationship with discomfort. Dopamine doesn't just rise with pleasure, it can also rise when the brain learns that effort itself predicts future reward. This is why people who consistently challenge themselves often report feeling motivated even during hard work. Their brains have learned to associate effort with progress. In this way, dopamine becomes a bridge between discomfort and meaning. To use dopamine wisely in goal pursuit, the strategy is simple but powerful. Design goals your brain can track. Make progress visible, celebrate small wins without overstimulation, protect dopamine by limiting constant high-reward distractions. And most importantly, start before you feel ready. Action generates dopamine, not the other way around. When you align goal setting with how dopamine actually works, motivation stops being mysterious. It becomes a biological signal you can shape. One step, one decision, one small win at a time. Most people believe motivation comes from rewards, success, praise, money, or achievement, but neuroscience reveals something far more powerful. The brain can learn to find effort itself rewarding. This shift is one of the most important differences between people who consistently achieve goals and those who rely on bursts of motivation that quickly fade. At the beginning of any challenge, Effort feels costly. The brain interprets it as energy expenditure, uncertainty, and potential failure. Early on, dopamine release is tied mostly to external rewards or imagined outcomes. But when effort is repeated in a structured way, the brain begins to change its prediction. It starts associating effort with progress, learning, and future reward. Over time, this rewiring causes dopamine to rise during effort, not just after success. This process explains why trained individuals often report feeling good while doing hard things. Athletes feel a sense of drive mid-workout. Writers feel momentum while drafting. Students feel engagement while solving difficult problems. These experiences aren't accidents or personality quirks. They are learned brain responses. The brain has adapted to treat effort as a signal that something valuable is happening. A key mechanism behind this shift is prediction error. When effort leads to better outcomes than expected, more clarity, improvement, or control, the brain releases dopamine and strengthens the connection between effort and reward. Repeated enough times, the brain stops asking, "Is this worth it?" and starts assuming that effort equals progress. Motivation becomes more stable because it no longer depends on distant outcomes. Importantly, this doesn't require extreme discipline or suffering. In fact, effort becomes rewarding most reliably when challenges are optimally difficult, not too easy, not overwhelming. When tasks are too simple, the brain gets bored and dopamine drops. When tasks are too hard, the brain predicts failure and pulls motivation away. The sweet spot is where effort stretches ability just enough to produce frequent learning signals. This is where motivation grows naturally. Another crucial factor is consistency. The brain learns through repetition, not intensity. Sporadic bursts of hard work followed by long gaps don't teach the brain to associate effort with reward. Consistent engagement, even at lower intensity, creates predictable dopamine patterns. Over time, the brain begins to crave the state of effort because it has learned that effort leads somewhere meaningful. This also explains why avoiding discomfort weakens motivation. When the brain rarely experiences effort followed by progress, it never gets the data it needs to rewire reward circuits. Effort remains associated with stress instead of growth. In contrast, gradual exposure to challenge teaches the brain that discomfort is temporary and productive. Effort shifts from being a threat to being a signal of forward motion. Identity also plays a role. When people repeatedly experience effort as rewarding, they begin to see themselves differently. They don't say, "I'm forcing myself to work." They say, "This is what I do." This identity feedback loop further strengthens motivation, because the brain is highly responsive to consistency between action and self-concept. The practical takeaway is powerful. You don't wait for effort to feel good, you train it to feel good. You do this by choosing challenges that are measurable, repeatable, and slightly uncomfortable. You track progress, not perfection. And you show up consistently enough for the brain to learn the pattern. When effort becomes rewarding, motivation stops depending on mood. It becomes a skill encoded in neural circuits. At that point, progress no longer requires constant willpower. Because the work itself has become the reward, the human brain is not designed to stay motivated by distant rewards alone. It thrives on evidence, proof that effort is working. This is where small wins become powerful. A small win is any clear signal of progress, no matter how minor it seems. Neuroscience shows that these signals directly rewire the brain's persistence circuits, increasing the likelihood that you will continue even when goals are difficult or slow-moving. At the neural level, persistence depends on how often the brain receives feedback that says, "Keep going." Each small win triggers a modest dopamine release, reinforcing the behavior that produced it. Over time, these repeated signals strengthen the neural pathways associated with follow-through. The brain learns that sustained effort leads to predictable progress, which reduces uncertainty and resistance. One of the biggest reasons people quit is not lack of ability, but lack of feedback. When progress is invisible, the brain assumes effort is wasted. Dopamine drops, attention wanders, and quitting feels rational. Small wins solve this problem by making progress visible. They give the brain concrete data that effort matters, even when the final outcome is far away. This is why breaking goals into measurable steps is not a productivity trick. It's a biological necessity. Each completed step becomes a reinforcement signal. Even checking a box or marking a streak matters because the brain responds to completion, not significance. What feels trivial to the conscious mind can be crucial to the motivational system underneath. Small wins also reduce the brain's threat response. Large goals often trigger stress circuits because they feel uncertain and uncontrollable. Stress narrows attention and pushes the brain toward avoidance. Small, achievable actions restore a sense of control. That sense of control lowers cortisol and allows dopamine-driven motivation to operate again. Persistence becomes safer at a biological level. Another important effect of small wins is momentum. Dopamine doesn't just reinforce past behavior, it increases the probability of future action. This creates a forward, driving loop. The more small wins you accumulate, the easier it becomes to start the next step. Over time, persistence stops feeling like a battle and starts feeling like a natural continuation. Small wins also shape identity. Repeated evidence of follow-through tells the brain a story: I'm someone who finishes things. This identity signal further strengthens persistence circuits because the brain seeks consistency between actions and self-perception. Motivation becomes less dependent on external pressure and more self-sustaining. It's important to note that small wins must be real, not imagined. Empty affirmations or false rewards don't produce the same neural effect. The brain is sensitive to authenticity. A small win works because it reflects genuine progress, learning something new, showing up on schedule, completing a defined task. The win doesn't need to be impressive, it needs to be true. Designing for small wins means lowering the starting threshold while maintaining direction. Instead of focusing on the entire goal, focus on the next visible action. Instead of measuring success by outcome, measure it by consistency. Over time, these small, repeated signals compound into powerful persistence. The deeper lesson is this: the brain doesn't build endurance through grand moments of triumph. It builds it through frequent, modest confirmations that effort leads somewhere. When you harness small wins, you're not just making goals easier, you're literally rewiring your brain to keep going when it matters most. Every goal eventually runs into stress and failure, missed deadlines, unexpected obstacles, and moments where progress stalls are not exceptions. They are part of the process. What determines success is not the absence of these moments, but how the brain interprets them. Neuroscience shows that the decision to quit or continue is made less by logic and more by how stress and failure are processed at the neural level. When stress appears, the brain shifts into a protective mode. Cortisol and adrenaline increase, narrowing attention and prioritizing immediate safety over long-term goals. In this state, effort feels heavier and risk feels amplified. If stress remains high for too long, the brain begins to associate the goal itself with threat. Motivation drops not because the goal is unimportant, but because the brain is trying to conserve energy and avoid perceived harm. Failure plays a similar role. When outcomes fall short of expectation, dopamine temporarily dips. This dip is not punishment, it's feedback. The brain is signaling that its prediction was off and needs adjustment. However, when failures are interpreted as personal flaws rather than data, the stress response intensifies. The brain shifts from learning mode into avoidance mode, increasing the likelihood of quitting. The key difference between persistence and withdrawal lies in recovery. Short bursts of stress followed by recovery strengthen resilience circuits. Chronic, unrelenting stress without recovery weakens them. This is why people often quit not after one failure, but after a long stretch of pressure with no relief. The brain simply runs out of capacity to stay engaged. Importantly, the brain does not distinguish between physical and psychological stress as clearly as we think. Poor sleep, lack of movement, and constant mental pressure all stack together. When baseline stress is high, even small setbacks feel overwhelming. In this state, quitting can feel like relief because it reduces immediate neural load. Reframing failure is one of the most powerful ways to change the brain's response. When failure is treated as information, what didn't work, what can be adjusted, dopamine recovers more quickly and learning circuits remain active. This keeps the brain in problem-solving mode rather than threat mode. Over time, the brain learns that failure is not the end of effort, but part of refinement. Another critical factor is self-talk. The language you use internally shapes neural responses. Harsh self-judgment increases stress hormones and suppresses motivation. Constructive, task-focused self-talk reduces emotional load and preserves engagement. This isn't about positivity, it's about keeping the brain oriented toward action instead of defense. Designing goals with built-in recovery also changes the quit-or-continue equation. Rest days, reflection periods, and deliberate pauses are not signs of weakness. They are signals to the brain that effort is sustainable. Recovery restores dopamine sensitivity and lowers cortisol, making it more likely that the brain will choose to re-engage after setbacks. Ultimately, the brain quits when stress outweighs meaning and recovery. It continues when effort is paired with learning, support, and restoration. Understanding this shifts failure from something to fear into something to manage. When you respect how the brain processes stress and failure, persistence becomes less about toughness and more about strategy. And that's where long-term goal achievement is truly decided. Most goals fail not because people lack discipline, but because the goals themselves fight the brain's natural wiring. The brain is not motivated by abstract intentions or distant outcomes. It is motivated by clear signals of progress, meaning, and reward. When goals are designed in alignment with neural reward systems, motivation becomes easier to sustain and far less dependent on willpower. The first principle of brain-aligned goal design is clarity. Vague goals like be successful or get better give the brain nothing to track. Without measurable signals, dopamine release becomes inconsistent and motivation fades. Clear goals define actions, timeframes, and criteria for progress. This allows the brain to predict reward more accurately, which stabilizes motivation from the start. The second principle is proximal rewards. The brain responds more strongly to near-term feedback than to long-term promises. This doesn't mean abandoning big goals. It means building smaller checkpoints along the way. Each checkpoint provides a dopamine signal that reinforces effort. Without these intermediate rewards, the brain perceives the goal as too distant and reduces engagement. Another essential element is challenge calibration. Goals must sit in the optimal zone of difficulty. If a goal is too easy, it fails to stimulate dopamine because there is no learning signal. If it's too hard, stress circuits dominate and suppress motivation. Well-designed goals stretch current ability just enough to create frequent moments of progress. This balance keeps the reward system active without overwhelming it. Autonomy also plays a powerful role in neural motivation. When goals feel imposed or externally controlled, the brain's reward response weakens. When individuals choose their goals, or at least understand the why behind them, dopamine release increases. Meaning amplifies motivation at the neural level. A goal connected to personal values activates reward circuits more strongly than one pursued out of obligation. Another often overlooked factor is tracking. The act of measuring progress is itself rewarding to the brain. Visual trackers, logs, and streaks convert effort into tangible evidence. This evidence reduces uncertainty and strengthens persistence circuits. The brain doesn't just like winning, it likes knowing it's winning. Goal design must also account for recovery. Neural reward systems are sensitive to depletion. Chronic overexertion lowers dopamine baseline and increases cortisol, making even well-designed goals feel draining. Sustainable goals include rest, variation, and periods of reduced intensity. Recovery is not a break from progress, it's a requirement for maintaining motivation over time. Social context further amplifies reward signals. Sharing progress, teaching others, or contributing to something larger than yourself increases dopamine and oxytocin, strengthening commitment. The brain is deeply social, and goals that include connection tend to be more resilient than solitary pursuits. Finally, effective goal design reframes success. Instead of defining success solely by outcomes, brain-aligned goals emphasize consistency and learning. This keeps dopamine engaged even when results fluctuate. The brain learns that showing up is rewarding, not just winning. When goals are designed around how the brain actually works, motivation stops feeling fragile. It becomes structured, predictable, and sustainable. You're no longer fighting your biology, you're using it, and that alignment is what turns intention into long-term achievement.